able to enrich the choices that we are making in our own spiritual lives, to develop a sense of halachic literacy, not just Jewish literacy, but halachic literacy and halachic pride. How many of us either hear ourselves saying, or we hear other people saying, I'm a very proud Jew, but I'm not observant. I'm a very committed Jew, but I'm not religious. What I hope that we will take away from our learning together is that there are myriad ways of being Jewish. There are myriad ways of engaging with Jewish tradition, and that it is appropriate for all of us to develop an affirmative, positive, embracing relationship with our tradition from a place of being informed, educated, and proud of the way in which our tradition has always adapted itself to remain a resonant, relevant, courageous, and responsible voice, not only in Jewish conversations about ethics and justice and faith and practice, but in the global conversations around what it is that we as human beings are called to embody and to devote ourselves to at this time. That's my introduction. And now let's dive into our first subject, laboratory produced meat, otherwise known as clean meat, cultured meat, cellular agriculture. Before we dive in, actually, let me pause and see if anybody has any questions or anything that you want to say in response to the introduction that I just gave. Please keep in mind that I can't see all of you. So if you want to say something and I don't see your hand raised, please just unmute yourself and jump in. I want this to be an informal, as interactive as possible time together. Anybody have anything burning that they want to say at this point? Okay, I will stop frequently along the way. And as I said, please feel free to stop me too. So full disclosure, I haven't eaten meat in about 30 years. And I am, because of that, especially intrigued by our topic tonight in terms of the possibility of lab-produced meat. And we will talk about how this development affects people who have chosen not to eat meat. What I'd like to do is run through some of the technical elements of our conversation tonight, and then raise what I think is one of the most fascinating questions of the symbolic ethics behind our conversation tonight, and really get a chance to hear from you the ways in which you wrestle with some of the questions that will be posed tonight. So the main focus of our halachic study tonight will be based on a tshuva, a rabbinic responsum of Rabbi Wayne Allen that was distributed to you. If you haven't read it before tonight's session, don't worry about it. You can read it after tonight. Rabbi Allen from the UTJ, the Union for Traditional Judaism. Just as a little background, the UTJ is a group of rabbis and scholars and lay people who advocate for a passionate, open-minded approach to Torah study and to observance of halakha, rooted in classical religious sources, but informed by modern scholarship. They are no longer denominationally based. They emerged from within the conservative movement many years ago, but split away from the conservative movement when the movement decided to ordain women back in 1985, and as a result of some other innovations, so that the fellowship that is comprised within the UTJ also includes some modern Orthodox voices as well. Now, bear in mind that this is a relatively new issue. And so as science and technology develops so quickly, there aren't necessarily perfectly analogous sources to which we can look in the halachic literature to understand how to resolve some of the questions that are posed today. But what we do have are frameworks for considering an issue. We have precedents that can be used to anticipate some of the real circumstances that have unfolded. And as we'll see in this issue, there are many different interpretations, as there are in just about every other matter of Jewish law. We are going to focus on Rabbi Allen's tshuva, but I will bring in some of those other voices as well. First of all, why is this such an important issue today? I'm going to share with you things now that are disturbing to hear, but I am pretty confident that I am not the first person to share them with you, that these are well-known realities of our world. When we slaughter an animal for food, only part of the animal is used for food, and there is a tremendous amount of waste that is involved, including in the kosher industry. When you shecht a kosher animal, about 60% of that animal is unkosher to use. Only 20% is actually ends up actually being consumed. And so as a way to mitigate that waste, there is an effort to look at how we could use 100% of an animal whose life we take for our own consumption. By the way, that's one of the reasons why other parts of kosher animals are used for other ritual purposes. The sinew that we find in an animal is often used to make the thread that attaches the parchment of a Torah scroll or a Megillah, which of course is also from the animal. We try hard to use everything that we can, but alas, there's a tremendous amount of waste. About 30% of the earth's arable land is used for the raising of animals to satisfy humanity's global appetite for meat. By 2050, when the human population is expected to exceed 9 billion people, the estimates are that we will be using 70% of the earth's land to satisfy that hunger for meat. About 50% of the world's habitable land has already been converted to farming land, taking tremendous, tremendous amounts of energy. Think of the effect on these industries on human hunger. About 70 billion farm animals are raised for food annually. In 2015, these are some of the most recent numbers we have. In the United States, people consumed 24.8 billion pounds of beef, with the majority of the cattle being raised in industrial feedlots. And those cattle, in addition to the other billions of chickens and pigs that are raised, those animals are consuming about 70% of the grain that is grown in the United States, much of which could otherwise be used to feed hungry Americans. In 2017, 15 million homes were food insecure. That's about 49 million people and 16 million kids. 45 million people on nutrition assistance program, 1 in 9 hungry people each and every day, 1 in 5 hungry children. In Canada, in 2019, there were over 833 million land animals that were killed in order to be consumed. And that was up drastically from about 750 million in 2015. That increase is largely due to the increase in poultry consumption. Beef and pork consumption tends to be stable or even marginally down. But Canada is one of the world's 10 wealthiest countries, and yet food insecurity has been rising in recent years. About 1 in 8 Canadian households experienced food insecurity in 2018. That's a number that, of course, has grown because of the pandemic. Canada reported about 4.4 million Canadians living in food insecure households between 2017 and 2018. Let's think also about the environmental impact of meat production. Cattle raising causes about 44% of greenhouse gases. Cows alone emit 39% of the methane that contributes to global warming. If we were able to produce the meat that we all hunger for in laboratories, there would be anywhere between a 74 to 96% reduction in greenhouse gases. And this is all not to mention the cruelty that we know the industrial animal raising industry inflicts upon calves, chickens, in the raising of these animals, and of course, in the slaughtering of these animals. And we know about the negative medical effects of consuming too much meat, the effects of grilling, of smoking, the nitrates, the effects on rates of cancer and heart disease and high blood pressure, and the overuse of antibiotics in livestock, which is causing superbugs and antimicrobial resistance that is really proving to be terribly problematic in all kinds of ways. So all of these are reasons for us to be concerned about our current consumption of meat as Jews and as socially conscious human beings, but especially given our Jewish consciousness of our long taught responsibility for stewarding the earth. Le'ovda u'lishomra, we are taught in the opening chapters of Sefer Breshit. The earth is ours to work and to protect. We have values such as the protection of animals, the prohibition of tsa'ar ba'alei chayim, of causing pain and discomfort to animals. We have clearly articulated mitzvot in the Torah, v'nishmartem et nafshotechem, to protect our bodies, to take care of our physical well-being. We have the mitzvah of tzedakah, patoach tiftach et yadecha le'achicha le'aniyecha ule'evyoncha ba'artzecha, to open your hands to those who are poor, to your fellow human beings who are hungry and who are without. All of our foundational values rooted in our sacred texts are coming into play in the untenable meat industry all around us. Now, there are two approaches to the challenge of cultivating meat that is ethical, that is sustainable, and that is environmentally friendly, and that is satisfying to our ta'ava, to our appetites. One is plant-based meat. Plant-based meat, right? Products that are created to taste like meat, that are made entirely of plant-based materials, use less land and water than raising animals, of course, emit much fewer greenhouse gases, have lower health risks compared to eating meat, although it is not the case that they are so much healthier for us. An Impossible Burger, if you look at the nutritional profile, is not that much healthier than a 100%, a 100% beef burger. Right? We do have to be careful. And there are some meat producers who are using that nutritional factor to fuel the debate around impossible meat, let's say. But the purveyors of impossible meat will tell you that though they acknowledge it's not the healthiest burger you can have, it is having an effect in drawing meat eaters into the possibility of being satisfied by something other than a pure beef patty. So it's in many cases being marketed as a transitional food for people seeking a healthier diet. Companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods have even infiltrated now Dunkin' Donuts, Burger King. You can get an Impossible Whopper. I mean, who would have thought? Never mind the major supermarket chains. But the second way to address this issue, which we're going to dive into tonight, is laboratory produced meat. How is meat produced in a laboratory? Very briefly, stem cells are extracted from an animal. They are put into a vessel. They are mixed with a nutrient-rich soup, which stimulates the growth of those cells. The cells then anchor themselves to a wall like an artificial tendon. They are stimulated electronically to become elastic, to become firm, and then once they grow into a sizable texture, once they grow into something that has a significant size and they've developed a substantive texture, then they are detached from that wall, packaged and sold. One of the innovators in this industry is a Dutch scientist by the name of Dr. Mark Post, who argued that this would drastically reduce the number of animals used worldwide for meat from about 10 billion annually to 10,000 annually, and would avoid the cruelty of slaughter and the other environmental and ethical pitfalls of industrial farming. He produced the very first laboratory-made hamburger in 2013 at the very modest price of $325,000. But don't despair. It's coming down, the price, to approximately now about $45 a pound of ground beef. Yeah, it's getting closer to kosher baby lamb chops, maybe, but it's on its way. Israel, no surprise, is at the forefront of this industry. There is a company called Supermeat based in Tel Aviv that says its products require 99% less land and 99% less water than conventional meat products and emit 96% fewer greenhouse gases. So the science behind the benefits of laboratory produced meats is almost incontrovertible. But what are the kashrut concerns around laboratory produced meat? There are essentially three questions that the kosher consumer has to contend with when it comes to laboratory grown meat. Number one, does removing stem cells from an animal, a live animal, constitute a violation of the mitzvah in the Torah against aver min hachai, eating a limb from a live animal, right? Eating a part of a live animal. Number two, if you were able to eat meat cultured in a laboratory, would it be considered meat, fleishig, or would it be considered pareve? And of course, the reason we need to get an answer on that is we need to know if we could eat it with dairy. And number three, if we could culture stem cells in a laboratory to produce meat, do those stem cells retain any halachic relationship to the animals from which they are extracted? If the answer is yes, then we would only be able to extract stem cells from kosher animals. But if the answer to that is no, could we extract animals from non-kosher animals? Extract stem cells from non-kosher animals and in a laboratory produce kosher pork chops? Those are the three questions that we have to wrestle with tonight. Okay. Any comments, any burning, any need to say something before we dive into these three questions? All right, moving right along. Aver min hachai, a limb from a living animal. In Breshit, chapter 9, verse 4, around the discussion at the end of the flood, and Noah comes out of the teva, and a new covenant, if you will, right, between God and humanity is affected. And as a concession, don't forget, with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, we were launched into a vegetarian life. We were launched into a vegan life, even. Really, we were given all the things that grow to eat. We were not permitted to eat animals when we were in the Garden of Eden. The eating of meat is a concession that is granted to us by God in the story after the flood, as a concession to the appetite, the sort of violent appetite, the blood hungriness, if you will, of the human experience. But it was not a unfettered license to eat meat. It came with a major qualification, and I'm not talking even about shchita, the ways in which we were to slaughter come later. But here in chapter 9, we read, Ach basar benafsho damo lo tochal. You must not, however, eat flesh with its lifeblood in it. Now, blood in the biblical understanding was the symbol of the life force. So those of us who eat kosher meat, we're familiar with all the soaking and the salting that the meat goes through in order to extract the blood from it. But part of that prohibition is not to eat anything from a live animal. Aver min hachai, a limb torn from a live animal. So we have to ask, are stem cells, which are the key ingredient of laboratory produced meat, do they constitute eating a piece of flesh from a live animal? Now, there are many different understandings of this isur that we find, this prohibition that we find in the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud. I want to draw your attention to Rashi's definition, which Rabbi Allen points to. Rashi defines a living limb as a limb that if you were to cut it off, could not be replaced. In other words, it would not grow back. So that only body parts that are irreplaceable are subject to the prohibition of aver min hachai, of eating a limb off a live animal. Okay, if you're gonna, this is terrible, if you're gonna rip a leg off a live animal and gluttonously sink your teeth into it, that leg's not gonna grow back. Eiver min hachai. Are stem cells considered replaceable parts? Do they renew themselves once they're removed? Rabbi Allen quotes evidence from the National Institute of Health to suggest that stem cells are not replaceable, so that according to Rashi, it would be a violation of Eiver min hachai to remove them. My very, very dear friend, Dr. Bryn Levy, who is a professor of pathology and cell biology at Columbia University Medical Center and the medical director of their genetics laboratory at New York Presbyterian Hospital at Columbia University, had this to say. It depends on how much of the host stem cells you take. If you take too much, they may not be able to regenerate quickly enough to prevent the host animal from suffering without them, right? A certain amount of stem cells are needed for optimal health. If you take only a small amount of them, then the host should be able to regenerate enough for themselves without consequences. So stem cells do regenerate. The question is whether you need to take so much that you would compromise their well-being. Now, the halachic issue might be around how many stem cells you need to take from an animal in order to have enough to create a piece of cultured meat in a lab, and whether you need so many that you would cause that animal to suffer, whether that would be halachically acceptable, or would the animal need to be slaughtered first and then take the stem cells, as some authorities have advised. Interestingly enough, none of the research that I have read addresses this question, but the science and the technology is changing very quickly. I mean, if you had to shech the animal before extracting the stem cells, I mean, on the one hand, you're still slaughtering animals and you would need to raise those animals to slaughter them. You would probably need many less. But the real question is, are microscopic stem cells even to be considered part of the body at all for us to even need to be having this debate? Rabbi Allen presents several piskei halacha, several halachic positions showing that in the legal tradition, there is ample precedent not to consider microscopic organisms to be of any halachic significance whatsoever. In other words, let's share some examples. If you need a microscope to detect scales on a fish, you're out of luck. That fish isn't kosher. Okay. I have an uncle in Israel who will not eat a piece of broccoli unless it's gone under a magnifying glass to make sure that there are no shvatzim, that there are no bugs there. But that is not the normative halachic position. Okay, think about it. Have you ever had a halachic authority tell you that the glass of water in front of you is treif? Of course not. But what's in our glass of water? Even from the pure, beautiful reservoir outside of New York City or Montreal, beautiful, clean, crisp water. In that glass of water, there are tons of tiny little organisms that we are ingesting. But no halachic authority forbids us from drinking a glass of water because microscopic organisms are not bearing any halachic significance, because the halachic sages from centuries ago understood that the Torah could never have mandated laws that were only possible to observe with technology that would only emerge generations, if not millennia later. How could the halachic literature from 1,500 years ago or 2,000 years ago say, but you can only do this right once the glass lens is invented and the microscope is invented? So stem cells, which are not visible to the naked eye, are halachically of no consequence. Now, I want to point out that here's a great example of the role of human subjectivity in halachic norms and standards. Because let's go back to that broccoli example. The laws of kashrut rely on you and me to look at that piece of broccoli. If you see shvatzim, if you see little bugs and insects, then that you cannot remove, then yeah, don't eat it. You are the determining factor as to whether that broccoli is kosher or not. But if you can't see it, if the naked human eye cannot see it, there is nothing there that is asur. Now, as new technology emerges, yes, we reconcile it with halakha, but halakha, whether it's biblical or rabbinic, could not have been dependent upon technology that didn't exist, as we said. So the bigger question is, as new technology is invented, do we have to reconsider how we're fulfilling all of our commandments? The authorities who weigh into this question around stem cells say no. Even though we have tools of magnification today, we are not halachically obligated to use them. Interestingly enough, there are other halachic scenarios where the development of new technology has impacted our relationship to certain laws. Think of the advent of electricity and the use of electricity on Shabbat. Think of the greater sophistication around math, science, and the ability to predict calendars for centuries and centuries at a time, and how that's affected the Hebrew calendar and the question of Yom Tov Sheni, a second day of Yantiv outside of the land of Israel. That is a topic we are going to be studying in a few weeks. And in our case, there is another opinion. Rabbi David Bleich, who's an Orthodox posek, an Orthodox halachic scholar, who quotes sources that argue that if you intentionally create something that will become perceptible to the human eye out of something that is imperceptible, then that product does actually have halachic status, right? In other words, it's one thing to not see something and then not have to consider it from a halachic standpoint. But if you're going to use that to make something that is clearly perceptible, then you may have another issue on your hands. Rabbi Allen does not follow that position. The next thing we have to ask ourselves is, are those extracted stem cells actually consumed, right? Is it actually food that we have to apply the analysis of kashrut in our conversations? Rabbi Allen argues that the stem cells themselves are actually not consumed. They are the source for the production of the muscle tissue that ends up getting eaten, but they themselves are not eaten. And Aver min hachai, eating a limb from a live animal, is a prohibition against consuming dafka, the limb. Even if this were considered something that we were consuming for which you had concerns, the stem cell is actually not what you are eating. What you are doing, he argues, is merely deriving benefit from the stem cell because it serves to instigate the production of what you will ultimately eat. Now, there's really interesting halachic discussion about whether you can benefit from something prohibited. Like, can you sell wine to a pagan who's going to use it for an idolatrous pagan ritual? Can you, as a Jew, sell non-kosher food? That's an interesting one. Even the question around whether you can eat chametz after Pesach that wasn't sold during the holiday. So here, if you're not actually eating the stem cells, but you're merely deriving benefit from them as stimulants for the growth of the meat in that Petri dish, then it should be permissible, even if you follow the poskim who insist that something microscopic that is used to create something that is perceptible has legal status, because you're not actually consuming that Aver min hachai, you're only benefiting from it as a derivative food product. Some have asked the question, are stem cells like what the halachic literature calls a davar ha'amid, something that causes something else to take form? The analogy would be to rennet in the production of cheese, rennet, which is a catalyst in the curdling of cheese, or something like yeast that causes wine to ferment, which according to the halacha, according to Jewish law, if that substance is made from something non-kosher, then it cannot be nullified, even if it's 1/1000th of the volume that it was stimulating in its growth. Now, Rabbi Allen argues that stem cells are not davar hama'amid. They are not the catalyst. What they are the source out of which the meat grows. He argues that unlike rennet, stem cells don't cause the meat to grow. They ultimately become the meat itself. Now, lest we think that this contradicts his position earlier that we don't eat the actual stem cells, what he would likely say is that we eat what the stem cells become. We don't directly consume a spoonful of stem cells. And to him, that distinction has halachic significance. Now, if I haven't overwhelmed you yet, what I'm going to tell you next is actually fascinating. Rabbi Bleich, who I mentioned before, is an Orthodox posek, argues something quite differently. He argues that a davar hama'amid, something that causes something to become something that is visible to the eye in its final form, like in cheese, since rennet causes the cheese to coagulate, when you look at the cheese, you're looking at the rennet. And since no matter what the volume is, it can't be nullified, the rennet is considered part of the cheese. And if it's not kosher rennet, there are many who would deem that whole cheese not kosher. As an aside, there are many halachic positions that do a different analysis on rennet, rendering cheese made of any rennet kosher. Happy to study that with you at another time. But to Rabbi Bleich, davar hama'amid is something that catalyzes the chemical and the physical change. And he thinks that in laboratory produced meat, the stem cells are doing exactly that. They may be infinitesimal, but because they get replicated over and over again in the Petri dish, when you're looking at that piece of meat, you are looking at those stem cells. And so if they're not kosher, or if you're not permitted to extract them, then that final product wouldn't be permitted either. He also cites those who say that davar hama'amid, that catalyst, is nullified so long as that the original flavor they contain isn't imparted to that new substance that they create. So if the original stem cell wasn't kosher and the lab meat that it produces tastes like meat, it can't be kosher. But if it doesn't taste like meat, maybe some halachic authorities would permit it. Not really helpful, because the whole point of these initiatives is to create something that does taste like meat. Now, he notes that if the stem cells were from a kosher animal and all the ingredients were kosher, it might be kosher to eat. And since in the rules of mixing meat and dairy, we have the concept of Beth-El b'shishim, where if something dairy falls into something meat, but it is of a volume less than 1/60th, we ignore it halachically, then potentially the original stem cells could be nullified, and that piece of kosher lab meat could be considered pareve, because you wouldn't be able to taste any of those tiny little stem cells. The example I always use when I'm teaching this is like I'm making a big vat of chicken soup, not for me, for my children. And Andy walks by with her 10th cappuccino of the day, and like a tiny drip of her cappuccino falls into the chicken soup pot. If that drip of cappuccino is less than 1/60th of the total volume of soup, doesn't matter. So if the lab produced meat tastes like something bland, like tofu, then maybe it would be pareve. But if it tasted like meat, which is the whole point, it would be fleishig, according to Rabbi Bleich. Interestingly enough, the head of the OU, Rabbi Menachem Genack, when he originally looked at this halachic issue of laboratory-produced meat, said that he thought that the meat would be pareve. But he's since changed his mind and has ruled differently. Again, the science and the technology is changing so fast. He now says that since the initial cells come from an animal and that they continue to divide, the end product continues to have the cellular structure of meat, and so it would be considered fleishig. Not everybody agrees, but there is some consensus in the halachic community that when it comes to matters of basar, of fleishig, we always rule stringently. At the end of the day, the point of nullification is also subject to some controversy, because if Andy walked by my vat of chicken soup and accidentally dropped something in it, like a little thing of cappuccino, then okay, it's nullified. But if you drop something potentially prohibited intentionally, relying on your use of that rule later on, that, becomes a little bit questionable, right? It can't be a core part of the production process In other words, if you're going to use the law of nullification as part of the design, then it becomes prohibited. So get this. This is his thinking. If you want to use this process and make a product that you are then going to certify kosher so that Jews can eat it, that would make it not kosher because you are relying on an emergency ruling for your routine production. And your intention is for Jews to eat it if you put a hechsher on it. The paradox is that if you go about production this way, according to Rabbi Bleich, if you actually get a hechsher on it, that hechsher is exactly what would make it treif. Capish? Right? Because you would be relying on this emergency outlet of the dissolving of that non-kosher stem cell, according to his thinking, in order to make the product acceptable. It's kind of fascinating. Okay, let's go back to Rabbi Allen. Rabbi Allen brings another source to show that when you are considering the definition of eating a limb from a live animal, Eiver min hachai, it's only the amount of the flesh that is considered, not the bones and not any other part of the animal. The violation only concerns the actual meat of the animal that you are eating. Stem cells are not flesh. It's not meat. It becomes analogous to Rabbeinu Tam's ruling from the 12th century that you can eat honey which may have some bee legs in it. Happens, right? I don't recall ever finding a bee leg in my mouth after eating honey, but Rabbeinu Tam says that those bee legs are like afra be'alma. They're like the dust of the earth. They are negligible in a conversation about the status of foodstuffs. In today's laboratories, interestingly enough, the use of insect proteins may become very common, and we're going to have to start dealing with that too. So let me just summarize the response to the first halachic concern about the violation of Eiver min hachai. Number one, taking stem cells from the muscles of a donor animal is not a violation of Eiver min hachai because they are A, invisible, and so they're halachically negligible. B, even if they become visible through magnification, you're allowed to derive benefit from them, especially since the stem cells, he argues, are not actually eaten. They are just the stuff out of which the meat is created. And C, even if you do consider them part of what is eaten, it's okay because they are not considered the flesh of that animal. And so there is no violation of Eiver min hachai. Now, based on this, with regards to our other halachic concern about whether this meat would be fleishig or pareve, and about whether you can use non-kosher stem cells, if stem cells are negligible and they're not even considered flesh, then it would seem that whatever you produce from them would be pareve, and you can add dairy to it without any concern. Here comes your cheeseburger. And if they're negligible and they're not even considered flesh, then it shouldn't really matter what kind of animal they come from, kosher or non-kosher. And so Rabbi Allen countenances the possibility of creating kosher pork and hechshered frog's legs. Let me pause for just a moment and see if anybody has any tearing out of the hair or anything you want to share. It's gonna get even better in just a few minutes. Adam.
So I have a question that I think would fall under Eiver min hachai that we haven't really talked about. It seems like we talked about it being a limb or not. Is it a limb? Is it taking something off a live animal? But what about the idea of coming from a live animal? I'm then going to eat it, where it's not going to be live anymore. That's for certain. Do I not have to?
What's not going to be alive? What's not going to be alive?
Are the stem cells considered alive? And if there's something living from an animal, do I have to shecht it to eat it?
So, that's the $1 million question.
Right.
And Rabbi Allen's argument is that even when you're extracting these stem cells from a living animal, they have no halachic status to require us to consider the question that you've just asked. It's analogous to the shratzim, the little creatures that are living inside a piece of a cruciferous vegetable, like
even if it grows into something substantial.
If you follow the argument, if you paskin by the argument, if you rule according to the argument that if they are microscopic, they have no halachic status, then you are absolved from wrestling with the question that you're posing. And as he argues as well, there's reason to consider them to have no essential relationship to the edible parts of animals.
Right.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Rabbi, it's Asher.
Hi, Asher.
Hi. So your comment about, I guess, the desire to create, kosher frog legs and, using, some to make kosher pork, reminds me of like our current practice in the last 10, 15 years to make kosher bacon bits, replicate bacon and, make kosher crab, with all the bar mitzvahs,
Oh, yes, I remember.
So like, it just seems to me that this is just like another variation of trying to be, like the others. We're trying to have everything that's out there.
So I thank you so much for raising that question, Asher. I want to just put a pin in it for a few more minutes to finish reviewing some of the halachic sort of technical pieces, and then I want to exactly get to the point that you're raising. I'm going to and any other comments or questions you want to put on
I
the?
had a quick question, which is
Sorry, just tell me who you are. I'm sorry, I can't see you.
I'm Benji Feinstein from Ottawa. Yeah.
Hi, Benji.
Hi there. Is this lab-grown meat? Does it have any fat in it, or is it just like lean protein cells? And does that affect? Because mostly meat, it gets a lot of flavor from fat. So as these stem cells, like, are they inserting fat, or is that part of it? Or?
Really interesting question, Benji. I'm not sure if I know the answer to that. If they are inserting anything that would have properties that we associate with fat, if for the product to be kosher, of course, it would have to come from a kosher source. And I would imagine that that these industries are seeking to create a sort of whole food in that sense. And so there must be something that fits that bill. These are industries that are still in production, so to speak, although it's getting very close. I believe there's one restaurant in Europe, I think, that is, or maybe it's in Asia, it might even be in Singapore, that is now a fully laboratory produced meat menu. And I believe there's one coming in Israel if it hasn't already opened. So the answer to your question is they must be putting something in there, but in the kosher version of this industry, it would, at that point, it would have to, of course, conform to kosher standards. And that's actually a really good bridge for me, Benji, to just add this piece of the technical background. Remember, I mentioned that the stem cells are put into a dish, and then there's a nutrient soup that bathes them. That's part of the stimulating of the growth. So what about that nutrients, the nutrient soup, if you will? Now, if it's algae based, then we have no problems. But what if that soup contains animal products? Oftentimes, that nutrient soup contains fetal bovine serum. Yuck. That is a liquid harvested from the blood of dead cow fetuses that are found in slaughtered animals. Just a reminder, if you're unmuted, please, if you would mute yourself again. Now, if there's blood in that serum, Well, we know that we can't eat blood if you're observing the laws of kashrut. So some might render it all not kosher because of that. Now, in the process, are the cells submersed in this soup, or are they just showered with this, right? Some of that technology is in development now, and we don't have clear answers to that. However, there are other halachic considerations that help us resolve the question. There is the principle of notein ta'am lifgam. If an additive imparts some kind of negative or distasteful flavor to something, then that additive is considered null and void. It has no halachic status and it cannot impact the kashrut of the food item. Now, the OU has permitted the use of fetal bovine serum in making laboratory produced meat, but it does say that the starter cells need to come from kosher slaughtered animals. And the serum, though, is okay, because by the time the serum is used, there's no blood left in it. And so there's no concern that we would be ingesting the blood. Companies in Israel in this industry are working with plant-based alternatives to fetal bovine serum, alternatives that are made of yeast and of other plants. Interestingly enough, also to avoid the whole question of stem cells and aver min hachai, eating the limb of alive animals, there are many industry leaders that are making meat by taking starter cells from, and Adam, this will also help you in the question you asked, from the non-edible parts of animals, like from the chicken feathers, not from the chicken flesh itself. I'm seeing some people go, ew, but listen to that. Because the laws of kashrut don't apply in the same way to non-edible parts of the animal. Science is changing so fast that the psak halachas are changing fast. Like I said, Rabbi Ganak changed from whether laboratory produced meat is fleishig or pareve. In 2013, Rabbi Yuval Cherlo, who is an authority on Jewish law, works with Tzohar, which is a tech-based halacha research organization in Israel, headed the ethics department there. In 2013 said that existing kosher laws don't have to be applied to lab-grown meat because it was never alive. And so he countenanced the possibility of kosher pork. More recently, Rabbi David Stav, who's the chairman of Tzohar, said that in spite of the fact that the meat was grown in a laboratory, Jewish law would consider it proper meat, and so it would not be able to be eaten together with dairy. He said, therefore, in such a case, meaning because the meat is defined in Jewish law as actual meat, all the laws, except for the laws of shechita, slaughtering, would apply to it, and therefore cultured pork would not be permitted for consumption according to Jewish law. As you can see, the law changes from the perspective of individual halachic authorities. As the science becomes more developed, individual halachic authorities are evolving in their positions, and B, between halachic authorities, there is very different conclusions. There are very different conclusions that are drawn. As you can see, Rabbi Allen arguing that kosher pork would seem to be eminently possible, and Rabbi Stav saying no, and Rabbi Bleich arguing no. So I want to conclude, or set aside at least for now, the technical halachic concerns, and I want to start moving in these last 30 minutes of our time together into some of the softer halachic issues, but no less urgent. I want to begin that conversation with concerns around marit ayin. Marit ayin is the halachic concept that certain actions, which should be permitted, are prohibited because other people could mistake what you're doing for something else that is clearly prohibited, causing them to think that it's permitted or to look at you negatively. In other words, that's one of the reasons, marit ayin is one of the reasons why some people won't eat a cold, if they keep kosher and won't eat, let's say, hot non-kosher supervised vegetarian food. They go into a non-kosher restaurant and with a kippah on, eat a cold salad, let's say. somebody who's walking by that restaurant sees them in the restaurant eating with a kippah on and makes the wrong assumption that that's a kosher restaurant, goes in and orders something that is clearly not kosher. Right? The concern about marid ayin very much comes into play if you're going to be sitting and eating with a kippah, not a veggie burger, but something that looks, smells, tastes, quacks like a real old burger with a slab of cheese on it, right? Or you're eating a pork chop, right? Marid ayin concerns would require some discussion, you might think. Listen to this. In the 16th century, Rav Moshe Isserles was the reigning Ashkenazi halachic authority in the 16th century. His commentary, the Mapa, is famously offered as a commentary that is woven through the Shulchan Aruch, which was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, who then was the reigning Sephardic authority. The Shulchan Aruch means the set table. Rav Moshe Isserles laid his Mapa, his tablecloth, on top of the set table. I love that imagery. These are our halachic authorities. We can't get away from food. We always say Jews, food, right? And there you have it. But in the 16th century, Rav Moshe Isserles ruled that if you're serving almond milk with meat, who knew, right? Califia Farms, way back in the 16th century. If you're serving almond milk with meat, he advised that we place some almond shells on the table so that everybody who passed by or who looked would know that that's not actually chalav, it's not actually milk. Later post-scheme, later halachic authorities would say, if you're using non-dairy creamer, you should put the carton on the table so nobody has the wrong impression that after you've just served your beef bourguignon, that you're serving milk with your coffee afterwards. Interestingly enough, no one today among the halachic authorities who is debating laboratory-produced meat has talked about the importance of signage, neither for plant-based meat or for laboratory-produced meat, but even more interesting, nobody has talked about it when it comes to plant-based meat. Right? Nobody has said if you're going to sit down and eat an Impossible Burger or a Beyond Burger that you should really have a sign there saying, I am eating a plant-based burger, right? It's really, really interesting. I put that on the table for you, but there is another issue that has come up recently that I want to bring to your attention, that I think is related, though it is not about laboratory produced meat. It's about this whole concept of meat that is not meat, in particular around the question of pork. And it goes to Asher's question. I mean, Bacos with an OU, right? My mother is on this shiur, and we never had Bacos in our home, and I'll be curious as to whether what I'm about to share with you has any, factor in that I never thought to ask you. If you go through a supermarket aisle today, you can find bacon, plant-based bacon with a big old OU on it. Recently, by which I mean a couple of weeks ago, the Orthodox Union, the largest kosher certifying agency in the world, decided not to certify Impossible pork. Impossible beef, yes. Beyond beef, yes. Impossible pork, which is a new product to hit the supermarkets, no. This is a product not produced in a laboratory made of stem cells from a pig. This is made entirely of plant-based ingredients, just like Impossible beef. The explanation offered by the OU is that it will create logistical challenges for kosher consumers who still to this day keep calling in with, I don't understand, I'm like holding a package of bacon in my hand that has an OU on it. Apparently, this is not a concern when it comes to the Bacos that you mentioned, Asher. This is a concern about marid ayin. This is a concern about lifnei iver lo titein michshol, before a blind person don't put a stumbling block. However, they did say, Rabbi Genack said, that they may revisit this question in the future. Maybe they will certify impossible pork in the future. Now, let's think about this for a minute. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to open up for the rest of our class, but I just want to say two more things. If it's not about the fact that there are 0 non-kosher ingredients in this product, then what is it about? What is it about non-kosher? What is it about impossible pork that is different than impossible beef? Because from an ingredients perspective, what are we talking about? Some seasoning? This has to do with pigness. This has to do with something cultural, something deeply ingrained that is suddenly emerging for the OU in a way that for some reason Bacos and shrimp cocktail did not. Now, David Zvi Kalman, who is the director of new media at the Shalom Hartman Institute, wrote a rejoinder. As you can imagine, the Jewish media blew up when the OU made this pronouncement. He wrote a rejoinder arguing that they made the right choice. He argued that the symbolic value of maintaining a separation between Jews who do not eat pork and the rest, well, it's not the rest of humanity. Muslims don't eat pork either, but for the Jewish community, and he surmised for the Muslim community as well, that the symbolism, the dividing line, the cultural differentiation that is universally recognized through the barrier of pork is worthy of being maintained. And in fact, there was a very interesting podcast between him and Yehuda Kurtzer, who's the president of Shalom Hartman, just a few days ago, or maybe a couple of weeks ago. He argues that it is even potentially vulnerable to the slippery slope argument, and compared it to the tshuva and the conservative movement that permitted the driving of automobiles to shul, which he feels led to widespread lack of observance on Shabbat. He says, just because new technology introduces things that feel discontinuous with the past doesn't mean that we should dismiss the past. But there's something about Jewish identity that is bound up with not eating pork, so that even if we can eat, we shouldn't. Now, I want to ask you, as I promised you I would shut up, and I will, what is it about the ethical considerations when it comes to Jewish identity that seems salient in this conversation with regards to kashrut that hasn't been the same for other ethical considerations around with regards to kashrut? Why is a chicken whose beak is cut off and who is forced to live in a tiny little cage and who is fattened unnaturally and really abused, why is that chicken, so long as it's shechted properly, deemed kosher? Why is meat that contributes to the existential threat to humanity in terms of our climate crisis, why is that considered kosher? Right? What makes impossible pork the boundary line here? So law, my friends, is not only about what we do. Halacha and law of all kinds is also a means of storytelling. I highly commend to you an article by the late Robert Cover, who was a legal scholar who taught at Yale Law School in the 80s, wrote an article in the Harvard Law Review. He died way too young. He was a brilliant, brilliant man and a Jew who wrote an article called Nomos and Narrative, Law and Narrative, and makes a beautiful argument how all of law is grounded in story. So what is the story of Jewish values and identity today that is being told when we say that we will or we won't eat pork products that can be made, whether in a laboratory or out of plant-based ingredients that actually technically are kosher, but for some reason feel unkosher to us? What is the story about the Jewish relationship to the planet when we say that this is a arguably planet-saving product that we will not certify. Okay, fair enough. Kosher consumers who eat impossible pork are not necessarily going to save the planet, but you get where I'm coming from. Let me stop talking and please let me hear from you.
I have two questions. Neil Glazer.
Hi, Neil.
First question is, you said that they won't, OU won't certify the Beyond Pork, but they do for the fake crab. What's the difference?
What are you asking me? What is the difference?
Yeah, why do they do the fake crab? I mean, you see somebody eating crab, you don't know if they're eating real crab.
Neil, I'm asking you the same question.
All right. The second question I have is, you mentioned that if it tastes like meat, then it should be considered fleishig. Well, one of the rabbis said that.
That is one of the halachic positions.
Right. But so what about Beyond Meat, or the other ones that taste like meat? I mean, Beyond Meat really tastes like meat.
Right. So in that case, the halachic authorities who argue that if it tastes like meat, if it's for meat that's produced in a laboratory, then there is reason to consider it fleishig. There would be no justification for that position when the actual ingredients in Impossible Burger are all plant-based ingredients. Right? They're talking about something that is made at least from a starter that is derived from an animal product. And if it tastes like meat, then that position argues it should be deemed fleishig. But you could make no scientifically sound argument from ingredients that are purely vegetable based.
Right. You go into a restaurant, you see somebody eating a Beyond Beef one, or you see somebody eating the laboratory grown one. You don't know the difference.
Well, you better know the difference. But you're right. Certainly the other person doesn't. Is there? Did you want to?
No, that's it. Thank you.
The floor is open, Chevre.
Hi, this is Sue in New York from
Hi, Sue.
Jackson. Hi, Jenny. It's so good to see you. I wanted to go back to stem cells, and as a biology student many years ago, and then working in genetics for many years, unless things have changed, stem cells they divide. They actually become whatever is being made or produced. So to say that they're not part of what's produced, I think is biologically incorrect. And therefore, like, just from that little knowledge that I have, I think of everything that comes from a stem cell of whatever animal it is part of that animal, and there's no question about it. And again, also looking at feathers or other parts of an animal that are not kosher, the question always comes down to why not? What is it about them? If you take it as God said no, it's not kosher and that's it, then you have nothing to go on. But I know that there's a reason. I just know that we don't know it yet. But I'm always reminded of that I had a professor in genetics in college who was teaching sex inherited. I forgot already what it was. Sex-linked inheritance of hemophilia, and he read from the Torah, and he said, you could marry the brother of a bleeder, but not the sister of a bleeder. And he went down and did a whole pedigree. And then everybody who was Jewish, which was most of the class, just looked at each other and said, that's word for word from the Torah that he just drew that pedigree. Now, God didn't explain that. God just said, don't do this and don't do that. So I always ask why. And even going back to like don't eat the leg of the animal. It's not about eating the meat. It's about killing, maiming an animal to me. It's like you don't rip off the leg of an animal or any part of an animal because you happen to be hungry right now. So, those are the things that I'm thinking of. And when I hear you talk about pork, taking a cell from from something and saying it's not pork, that's not the science of it. It just isn't. And I think we just need to go back to science.
So Sue, you raised very interesting and important points. I want to make sure I understood you correctly when you said that we don't know why the Torah says you can eat this, but you can't eat that, but at some point we will understand why.
I believe we will, that as we become more technologically advanced. I mean, this professor was very, very clear to point out that at that time, which was in the 1970s, that medicine had only discovered sex-linked inheritance 50 years before. And he was reading it out of the Torah. So we've got a couple of millennia, to catch up, and maybe it will become evident to us, but I think that the evidence is there, but we just don't know it.
So it's an interesting position. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And in fact, the Chazal, the sages in Talmudic times and throughout medieval and still today, the laws of kashrut are classified as chukim. A chuk is a class of Jewish law for which we concede there is no logic, there is no reason. Unlike a mishpat, a judicial ruling for which there is infinite logic, like don't steal or don't kill. The laws of kashrut, in terms of which species of animals were permitted to eat and not permitted to eat, to the rabbi's understanding, bore no relationship to science or to logic. And despite our best efforts to say, well, pigs are dirty, or, we eat only animals that don't eat other animals, right? All kosher animals are all herbivores. Despite our best attempts to overlay on top of the laws of kashrut some meaningful explanation, the halachic tradition, by and large, has resigned itself to no, framework that we can attach them to. Having said that, the rabbis, as the architects of the way the halakha is interpreted and reimagined in every generation, has come up with, the system has come up with scientific or technical foundations for resolving questions within that system. So in spite of your very, very eloquent and far more knowledgeable position on these matters than I possess, if the halachic system says that something that is negligible to the human eye bears no halachic status, then it renders to a certain extent that kind of wrestling moot. I'll tell you something else that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So around the question of lab-produced pork, is or octopus or right, any kind of shellfish. There is a company in New York that is actually endeavoring to create laboratory-produced seafood because the biodiversity in our oceans is so has become destroyed. So there is a question, right, of whether something that you extract from an animal necessarily retains a relationship to its source, or whether it can be considered something new. Identity, when it comes to species, according to the halakha, hinges on the line of descent, not on external features. So for example, if an animal is born to a cow, a kosher animal, but it emerges without split hooves, it's still kosher. If a baby pig emerges from its mother and miraculously has kosher characteristics, it's still not kosher. That is Rabbi Bleich's argument that cultured meat made of stem cells from a non-kosher animal since it's not the product of the natural development of the animal, it's not an expression of descent, and doesn't necessarily acquire the identity of the animal from which the stem cell was taken.
Not buying it.
What's that?
No, I don't agree.
Again,
Yeah.
so where are we?
I want to go straight back to, this is the cell from which which animal it was taken, and whether that's kosher or not. And then everything is a derivative of that, because those cells have divided and divided again and again and again and differentiated, and they're still, a pig is a pig.
By the way, this makes for a very interesting conversation also around questions of matrilineal and patrilineal descent.
Well, I was thinking about that.
But
Just
it's not our
as you
topic
were
for
saying, that'll be another session. But as you're saying about the pig being born of whatever, it's like, well, you always know who the mother is, but it is what it is. It's still a pig.
Okay. Any other comments on? I mean, linking to what Sue says. Where does the non-scientific, non-technical voice come in terms of, for example, the refusal to certify impossible pork? I'm really curious. How do you feel? Was that the right decision for the OU?
Can I jump in, Rabbi Lewittes? This is Howard in Montreal.
Hi, Howard. Sure.
I'd like to widen the arena just a bit with your permission.
Please.
I'm in a restaurant and I'm eating this pseudo pork, and someone says to me, "Howard, you're eating pork?" And I say, no, it's not real, it's stem cell. And then I have a cheeseburger, and he says, "This is a cheeseburger. What kind of a Jew?" And I say, "Well, not really. This was made of vegetables." And then I have a beefsteak that was made from something else. And I say, yes, I'm doing all of this, but I'm doing it in a good way, and I'm saving the world. Look at all the cows that I'm not leaving out there in the pasture. My wider arena question is the following. We as Jews have always been different. We differentiate ourselves in many ways, one of which is by the way in which we eat and in which we're perceived to eat. So the question is, looking at this as an example, are we beginning now to look at the fine edge of losing those identifiable factors, starting with eating, which make us Jews? Are we looking at kashrut today and something else tomorrow? And we ask ourselves, where is the Jewish identity line being drawn in this argument? And that is my question to you.
That is David Zvi Kalman's position. That just because we can doesn't mean that we should. And what gets lost in the equation? My only pushback, and it's, for the sake of argument, not for the sake of Chalila, no disrespect to your position that you just articulated. I'm very moved and taken and engaged with those very questions. But for a generation that we are living in, where, yes, we distinguish ourselves. Listen, the word kadosh, which means we use it and we translate it as holy, philologically means separate. To make something kadosh means to make it apart from, to make it separate from. And our identity has been rooted in distinctiveness, as you say, as some would say, even in exceptionalism. But we live in an age today where the social structures that encourage that made that possible, have all been radically redefined. We live in an age defined not by the boundaries that segregate us from other cultures and other communities, but we live within a world where those walls are now full of holes, where there is so much porousness between the different communities with whom we are in relationship. Our children and our grandchildren, and even some of us, are living lives fully immersed in the global community around us. And many of the laws, the ancient laws around food distinctiveness were actually designed to prevent the kind of social interactions that we pride ourselves on today, including pat akum, eating the bread of someone who isn't Jewish, including even the drinking of non-certified wine. So in a world that prides itself on being part of the global family, in a world in which our generation of Jews understands that we have not just opportunities to be fully integrated into the human family, we have responsibilities to be integrated into the human family. What role should the traditions that keep us apart play in the building of those relationships which are crucial, where our distinctiveness may need to take different forms? And how will we argue to a generation of ever more knowledgeable, ever more scientifically educated and sophisticated Jews? How could we argue that something that has not one mitigating ingredient could be considered treif? So I feel what you are saying, the symbolic value of it, I feel it. But is that the campaign that we should be waging in an effort to reimagine and to renew not just Jewish identity, but Jewish identity in an ever more diverse and complex world? Is there room for nuance? Maybe impossible pork is just impossible, but we have no trouble with impossible beef. Where are those lines and why? I think we have time for maybe one more comment or question.
I have a comment.
I can't see you.
Adam.
Oh, Adam, sorry, I can see you.
I mean, it just seems, liturgically speaking even, that pork has always been its own thing. If it's Shulchan Aruch, if it's Rambam, if it's Gemara, you know, the famous story, I think it's in the destruction of the Second Temple, where in the Beit HaMikdash they had a lift, some type of dummy waiter thing, where they would send up food for the Kohanim, or some food was sent up through this system. And when the Romans were coming in, then they switched it to pig. And the Midrash goes that when the pig got halfway up this well, the entire Israel shook, and there was this declaration that we can't even raise pigs. Rambam, I think, classifies pigs in its own thing, saying that like and it seems to be like almost in our like DNA that there's this Jewish revulsion against pigs. Not that I'm saying that the impossible, pork decision was the right one. I'm just saying that this is something that we've really had a history with, and it's been one of, it's not for us, Yeah. Yeah.
Adam, the old joke of Mr. Katz.
No.
Who goes out to dinner, goes to a non-kosher restaurant, celebrating with his family, orders the roasted pig, and looks up, and all of a sudden there's his rabbi walks into the restaurant, like the Lubavitcher rabbis who walk into the restaurants trying to give everybody a bracha. And he's panicking. The rabbi walks over to his table just as the waiter comes out with this massive roasted pig on a tray, and in the pig's mouth is this beautiful red apple. And the guy panics. The rabbi's eyes are like, what's going on here? And Kat says, Rabbi, have you ever seen such a fancy restaurant? You order an apple and it comes with this huge garnishing.
I mean,
Anyway, I feel what you're saying. It's a tough one.
I'll tell you,
But-
I have this mom and tot group, okay? And so I sing, Shabbat songs, but I also sing kid songs. And I once had a mom tell me that I shouldn't sing Old MacDonald had a farm, and on his farm he had a pig. And oink oink here and oink oink there. Because I mean this is on a level of kashrut that like it's unheard of, right? It's this DNA revulsion to it. Might just be too early for Impossible Pork. Give us a generation or two. It's.
But it's not too early for little crunchy things on your salad that look and taste like pieces of crumbled pork. But I hear you.
Totally.
We are living in completely contradictory
times.
Chevra, the point is, as we wrap up, that we're talking about food, yes. We're talking about science. We're talking about technology. We're talking about identity. We're talking about culture. We're talking about the past, and we are talking about the future. Who it is that we are as a Jewish community, the way in which we show up in the world as Jews, and the relationships that we seek to build, not only within our communities and families, but between us and the communities with whom we share this world and with the planet itself. Those are many, many urgent and holy callings that we need to consider as we look at questions of Jewish law in our very modern, complicated world. And just to tease you to come back next week, we'll be talking about cremation and the halachic possibilities of alternatives to traditional burials, and how the halacha has evolved on those questions, which are very live and very, very current and urgent for many people, for many similar reasons that we talked about Impossible Pork and lab-produced meat tonight. I want to thank you so much for being with me and for all of your comments and questions. We're going to end with Kaddish to Rabbanan for having gathered tonight to study Torah together. If it's your custom to rise for Kaddish and you're able to, I invite you please to do so. And you can also unmute yourselves to be able to say Amen. Yitzgadal b'kadash shemei rabbah. Be'omad yivrach yirtei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayachonu v'yomechonu b'chay d'chol Beit Yisrael. V'agalav b'zman kariv imru Amen. Yehei rabbah v'barach d'olam v'le'maya. Barak v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithatar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei d'kedusha baruchu. Ve'ela min kol berchata v'shirata tishbechata v'nechamata d'amiran be'omad v'imru Amen. Al Yisrael va'al Rabbanan va'al Talmidehon ve'al kol Talmidehon ve'al kol men de'oskin be'oraita diva atra hadain v'di b'chol atar v'atar yehei lahon l'chon shlama rabba china v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arichin u'mizonei revichei v'forkana min kodam v'huhandi b'shmai v'imru Amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim tovim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav hu b'rachamav ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Laila tov, everyone.